Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Michael Greening and I am Senior Lecturer in English Literature at Lancaster University, and what I have for you today is a talk entitled Literature Since 1945, a Brief Contextual Introduction. This is a talk which will give an overview of some key trends in and some key contexts for literature and culture since 1945, and there will be some interactive elements along the way, so I'm going to pose some questions and I'm going to offer you some talking points for you to think about. And what I simply invite you to do is, when I ask the questions or when I present the talking points, pause the recording, have a think, have a chat, jot down your answers, and then continue through the talk. So I'm talking about contemporary literature. I'm talking about the contemporary period. The contemporary period is a really attractive period of literature to study, and one reason it's attractive is because we're part of it. So it has an immediacy. The kind of immediacy that maybe when you study Shakespeare or Chaucer, they may not possess, because the language might seem archaic, we might not get the historical references, and the themes and preoccupations might seem remote from us, but that doesn't apply to something that is written in the here and now. So that's something that I think makes contemporary literature appealing. But also there's a challenge there, and the challenge is this, that I think sometimes it's hard to analyse something when you're part of that thing. I think it can be hard to analyse contemporary history and culture for the very reason that we're part of it. We don't have distance, we don't have objectivity. So my first talking point is designed to give us, if not absolute objectivity, then maybe just a little bit of distance from the late 20th and early 21st centuries, and just to think about what were the key events or trends or changes of this period of history. With a thought experiment. I want you to imagine that someone from 1820, someone from 200 years ago, has somehow, who knows how, they've managed to get in touch with you via email, and they want to know what it's like to live in the modern world, to live in our contemporary world. They're very, very curious to know all about it. What would you tell them? What would you tell this person about our contemporary world? What things or events or trends or changes would you want them to know about? But there's a catch. I want you to imagine that you're only allowed to tell this person 5 things about our contemporary world. So almost bullet points or headline news, the 5 top aspects of the contemporary world that you would tell them about. What would you put on your list? So I should add that there's no definitive answer to this. There's no absolutely scientific right or wrong answer to this. Your list will probably be different from my list, but let's see what we come up with. So I'm going to ask you to, or invite you to, press pause, see what you come up with, and then I will unveil the 5 items that are on my list. Okay, so when I did this exercise, these were the first 5 things that occurred to me. I think I would want to tell my friend from 1820 about globalization. Globalization, how would I explain or illustrate this concept? I would say that, for example, this recording I'm making now, I'm making it on a machine that was designed in California and built in China, and I'm using it in Lancaster to speak to you, well, wherever you happen to be in the world. So globalization is a term that refers to this new and unprecedented sense of interconnectedness, which would be completely weird and wonderful to contemplate if you come from a more kind of restricted culture, as someone from 1820 almost certainly would have done. I'd want to tell my correspondent about feminism and LGBT rights. I'd want to tell them about the fact that not only do women in the UK now have the vote, but we've had 2 female prime ministers. I'd want to tell them about the fact that we now have equal marriage. And again, I think this would be kind of extraordinary news for someone to try to digest in the early 19th century. There would be bad news as well to tell this person. I would want to tell them about environmental crisis. I'd want to tell them about global warming or global heating, but also perhaps about Extinction Rebellion and about the dawning of a new sense of environmental awareness in the early part of the 21st century. I'd want to tell this person about technology. This would be a hard story to tell because technology is so double-edged. When we think about technology, are we thinking about atom bombs and drone warfare? Or are we talking about state-of-the-art medicine and vaccines? Technology can destroy lives, or it can save, and it can preserve, and it can prolong lives. So it is an extraordinarily double-edged phenomenon. Finally, I think I'd want to tell my correspondent about consumer culture. Consumer culture is something that is so familiar to us that I think it's worth taking a step back from it and realizing how alien it would be to someone a couple of hundred years ago to describe to them a situation in which if you want a drink of water in the 21st century, someone might say to you, do you want fizzy water or still water? Do you want Perrier or Evian? Do you want a fruit infusion in that water? Do you want ice cubes? So there are so many different ways to consume just one resource or one commodity, and that applies to not just to drinks but to food. So thinking, oh, I'd like Italian food, or I'd like Thai food, or I would like Chinese food. Your friend from 1820, that would just not have been a reality for them, and that applies to clothing, or to music, or to television. So think about that moment, for example, when a 21st century person might be scrolling through Netflix and thinking, what am I going to watch tonight? And think about that almost inexhaustible world of consumer choice, that there is no end of ways for us to consume resources, no end of ways for us to entertain ourselves. And often our sense of identity in the modern world is bound up with what we consume. So someone might be a foodie, so they're into a particular kind of food, and that sort of defines their identity. Or it might be in terms of the particular clothes they choose to wear and the particular music they choose to listen to. Put those two together, that might give them a membership of a subculture. It could be, I don't know, goth or whatever. So defining who you are in terms of the consumer choices you make, I think this would have been, quite a kind of weird and wonderful news potentially for our friend from the early 19th century. So that's it. Those are my 5 pieces of headline news from the late 20th and early 21st century. Are these the 5 right answers? Are these the 5 definitive answers to that question? Well, no. I think that there are probably any number of legitimate and interesting ways of defining what really matters and what really is really at stake and what is really changing in our world. But that's a start, and it will be interesting to think about what your 5 key trends are that you've identified. So those are key trends in history and in culture. What about in literature? Again, the list I'm going to offer you is not definitive and it's not exhaustive, but it's designed to get you thinking and designed to provide you with a starting point. So I'm going to talk about diversity, about anti-establishment and countercultural writing. I'm going to talk about the breakdown of old literary categories, and I'm going to talk about dystopia. To begin with diversity, in a way, this is a simple, but I think very important perception about literature in the modern world is it's more diverse than ever. And the way I would prove that would be simply to invite you to take a look back in time at, for example, the writers who have won the Nobel Prize for Literature over the years. This is the single most prestigious prize that goes out to writers. It's the one that I guess anyone would want to win, and it was established right at the beginning of the 20th century. So it's been running for about 120 years. There have been interruptions during periods of war, but there are probably around 100 winners of the Nobel Prize for Literature. If you were to go through the winners from the first winner onwards, it would go something like this: white European man, white European man, white European man, white European man. Over and over again, it has been awarded to white European men. Every so often, there has been a bit of diversity, but really, from the early years of the 20th century up to maybe as late as the 1980s, it was dominated by that just one category of white male writers. But things are changing. Things are changing, and this is just simply a small showcase of some of the most distinguished and some of the most celebrated contemporary novelists. So Hilary Mantel, Kazuo Ishiguro, Salman Rushdie, and Toni Morrison. Between them have won the Booker Prize, so the most prestigious prize specifically for fiction. and the Nobel Prize, so the most prestigious prize all around. And Ishiguro has won them both. He has won both the Booker and the Nobel Prize for Literature. Ishiguro is an Anglo-Japanese novelist. Salman Rushdie is an Anglo-Indian novelist. He's not only won the Booker Prize, but when the Booker judges got together and said, what is the best ever winner of the Booker Prize? They said, it's Midnights for Children by Salman Rushdie. So it's just a kind of snapshot what I'm presenting you here, a snapshot of I think a much more healthy sense of diversity that you confront when you think about late 20th and early 21st century literature. One of the key trends in this period for me has been the emergence of anti-establishment and countercultural writing. I'm giving you two examples here. One is from the UK and one is from America. So you have John Osborne's play Look Back in Anger, and you have Ken Kesey's novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Both of these are influential anti-establishment works, and works that express feelings of frustration, discontent, and even anger with the existing social and political systems and hierarchies. I think there are links between this tradition in literature and youth culture more generally. So specifically or particularly in the 1960s and in the 1970s, you have the hippie movement, flower power movement, punk rock. And one of the common denominators between these different subcultures is the way they set the young against the old. So they are youth culture movements that look at the status quo, they look at the old guard, they look at the establishment, and they emphatically do not like what they see. So one thing that I think dies a long and lingering death in this period is the culture of deference. Now, what is deference? Deference is when you bow down to people whose social status is higher than yours. It is a kind of exaggerated respect for your superiors, and the notion that just because someone is of higher status than you, just because they are a sir or a duke or an earl or whatever, just because they have that status automatically means that they are personally and morally superior to you. That notion of that people sometimes have a kind of intrinsic superiority has really, as I say, come under concerted attack since the emergence of youth culture in the late 20th century. Okay, the next trend that I wanted to talk about is the breakdown of old literary categories. I'm going to explain this simply by using three examples. So the first, I'm sure these texts are known to a great many of you. So the His Dark Materials trilogy by Philip Pullman. There's a new trilogy underway, isn't there, even as we speak. But the first trilogy in the 90s, when that came out, there was an awful lot of talk about what people began to call crossover literature. And the reason they called His Dark Materials crossover literature is because, in a way, they didn't know how to categorize it. That this is a novel, the first of the novels has a talking bear in it. So it seems to be very much set in the world of make-believe and children's literature. But the thematic content of the His Dark Materials novels is very sophisticated, very dark, and in many ways very adult. So does it belong to children's literature? Does it belong to adult literature? Well, it seems to cross over those two categories. It seems to straddle the divide between them. Another example would be, this is a graphic novel by Nick Donasso called Sabrina, which was the first graphic novel to be longlisted for the Booker Prize. A graphic novel is, again, in a way, unclassifiable, because again, it seems to belong to two categories at the same time. Is it a comic? Is it a novel? Is it aimed for maybe a more childlike or young audience, or is it aimed for a sophisticated audience of novel readers? Well, it belongs to both categories simultaneously. So there's another kind of crossover there between comic fiction and literary fiction. A final breakdown of old literary categories occurs in 2017 when the singer-songwriter Bob Dylan received the Nobel Prize for Literature. And there was a controversy about this, because people normally separate pop music and rock music from traditional or serious literature. So the idea that pop lyrics or rock lyrics could count, not just count as literature, but count as some of the most celebrated literature of our time, it really did raise some eyebrows. So once again, we have an example of a crossover between different cultural categories, between rock and literature, which seems to shake things up. It seems to suggest that we thought we had these pigeonholes, we thought we had these categories, and we thought everything was neatly tied down and labelled. But in the late 20th and early 21st century, there's a kind of fluidity about things. It's as though maybe we need to get rid of the old categories, maybe we need to invent new ones, or maybe we just need to stop pigeonholing things altogether. So this brings me to my next talking point, which is this, is why do we feel the need to subdivide literature into genres and categories? Because we do it all the time. We might talk about children's literature, or we might talk about crime fiction, or the old categories of comedy and history and tragedy. It seems to be something that we're almost hardwired to do, that we like to categorize and to pigeonhole. But do we absolutely need to? Could we, for example, get by without these categories? And what would you see as the potential upsides or the potential downsides of a breakdown in those old categories? So again, you might like to pause the recording here, have a think, have a chat, or have a scribble about those questions. Okay, the final point of focus in this talk is going to be about a particular genre, which seems to me to be enjoying a kind of golden age in the late 20th and early 21st century literary culture, and that genre is dystopia. This is just a small section of some of the major dystopian novels that have been published since 1945, and I'm sure many of the titles will be familiar to you, and you may well have read some or indeed many of these texts. You have Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, about a world in which reading and books are outlawed, in which books are ritually burnt, or Bernardine Evaristo, very powerful, disturbing novel called Blonde Roots, which is about an alternative world and an alternative history in which white people have been enslaved by black people. So it takes the history of the slave trade and flips it and gives you a kind of disturbing new version of what is already a very disturbing story. So there are a great many novels in this genre, and I think it has a real reach and a real appeal to modern readers. This is something that I'd like you to think about, because dystopias represent a world that has gone horribly and oppressively wrong, a world in which you really wouldn't want to live. They often deal with totalitarian systems. So a totalitarian system is one in which privacy has effectively been abolished and in which the authorities control all aspects of our lives, including our bodies and even our thoughts. So Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale is about the control of women's bodies and women's reproductive capacities by a male-dominated system. And novels like 1984 by George Orwell or Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, one thing they're about is brainwashing in the sense that in a totalitarian world, you can't even choose your own thoughts. So this is very disturbing material. And my question really is, no one would want to live in a dystopia, but we seem to like reading about them. Why is this? So once again, I invite you to pause, have a think, or have a scribble in response to that question. Okay, what are my answers, or what are my possible answers to the question of why dystopia can be such an appealing proposition for readers? I've got a variety of answers. I think you could argue that dystopia is prophetic, that it's telling us about what is to come, and who wouldn't want to know, who wouldn't want to learn about the future? Your friend from 1820 was all ears. They wanted to know all about 2020, even if the news was bad, even if the news was disturbing, they wanted to know all about it. So maybe that's one thing that makes dystopia compelling, is the element of prophecy or prediction. Relatedly, you could say that dystopia is preventative, that maybe the function of dystopian novels is not to say, this is what's going to happen, it's inevitable and it's escapable, but rather, this is what will happen if we don't make the necessary changes. So it is a kind of, almost like a kind of worst case scenario that you can avoid if you're exposed to it and you know exactly what steps to take to avoid it. You could argue that dystopia is diagnostic, and this would be, in a way, a slightly more unsettling way of dystopia. You could argue dystopias are not about the future. They're not about what's going to happen. They're not about what might happen. They're about what has happened. They're about the world we live in. That when Margaret Atwood writes about an alternative world in which women's reproductive capacities are controlled by men, well, you only have to look around you in the real world to see, well, that's not some kind of far-fetched, disturbing fantasy, but something that where you can point to examples in the real world. Or when Nadine Evaristo writes about slavery and the horror of slavery, she's not presenting it as a far-fetched scenario, but something that is a really horrendous part of human history that we don't always acknowledge, perhaps as fully as we should. Final answer to the question about why dystopia is an appealing genre would be to suggest that perhaps there is something reassuring about dystopia. So how can dystopia be reassuring? I suppose dystopia can be reassuring if you're exposed to a world which is so disturbing and is such a worst case scenario, and you're reading about that world and its horrors, and it could be, kind of torture or brainwashing in 1984 or in A Clockwork Orange, and you get to the end of that novel and you close it and you put it back on your shelf and you think, it's only a novel. So no matter how bad life is, no matter how bad the contemporary world is, perhaps you could say, well, I'm not being brainwashed and tortured, so maybe life's okay. So you could argue that one function of dystopia is to reconcile ourselves to the modern world, that no matter how bad it might seem, it could be ever so much worse. So I've given you 4 different answers to the same question there, and what you'll notice is that those answers aren't compatible. They can't all be true, or can they? I guess I would leave that with you as a final point for discussion and a final talking point. Hope you've enjoyed this quick whistle-stop tour of literature and culture from 1945 to 2020. Just to leave you with contact details if you'd like to know more about what it is to study English literature at university level. We're always delighted to hear from potential applicants. So there you have an email address, and there you have a website where you can find out more. Thank you.